Okay, so just a couple of things to get out of the way first, before I get into this video. One of our compatriots, Nick Redding, here in Edmonton, is currently looking for work, and he's apparently very, very good at lifting and lugging things. And if anybody at all, has any leads for him as to where he can apply, or maybe he could make a phone call on his behalf, he would be very, very much grateful. You can contact him through the email I will leave in the low bar, through the Men's Rights Edmonton website, and hopefully we will get him back to work soon. Next up, author Tim Goldich, who wrote the book Loving Men, Respecting Women, and whose philosophy is essentially that it all balances out. He will be giving talks in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa between April 21st and 23rd. And you can find more information on that on the CAFE, Canadian Association for Equality website. If any of you would like to attend, I highly recommend it, and it's just a shame that I won't be able to go because it's way the fuck on the other side of the country, so bummer. Now, to get to the meat of this video, I was stalking the comments section of my Jian Ghomeshi video, which I sometimes do, now that the verdict is not guilty, because I just wanted to see if the conversation had changed at all given the update to the status of that trial. And I noticed that I had a larger proportion of feminists in this particular comment section than would otherwise be the case. Some of their comments were interesting, and I wanted to just pick out a couple of them and just kind of unpack them. So I think I'm probably going to do one video on this first one, and then I'll do another video on another series of comments by another commenter. So first up, Nathan Yu, he says,
interesting perspective. You end by saying that advocating change amounts to dismantling a system that will keep men and women from being victimized. Sorry, what?
Why, yes. Yes, I do say that. It keeps men and women from being victimized by the state, an entity that has more power and wherewithal than the most prolific serial killer to ruin people's lives, and whose power is and should only be tolerable to us because it is constrained by the people it governs from abusing that power. After I uploaded this video, I was emailed by a man who'd been wrongfully accused of a serious crime. If I recall, he'd been misidentified. He noted that I had used the word kidnap when talking about wrongful arrest and conviction, and he applauded me for doing so. For someone who has committed no crime, the state is essentially kidnapping them, using force to take them away from their lives and toss them into a cell. Now, there are countries in the world whose governments do this without due process, sometimes without any charge, without access to lawyers. There are countries in the world whose governments conduct sham star chamber kangaroo trials where the verdict is always guilty, where people are executed without ever having the opportunity to present a competent defense. I mean, heck, in Nazi Germany in the decade leading up to the Holocaust, they had publication bans on the names of Aryans who accused Jews of crimes. Very interesting, some of the parallels. I give zero fucks whether those corrupt systems that routinely wrongfully imprison innocent people are doing so on behalf of El Presidente or on behalf of women like Lucy Ducoteur. I couldn't care less whether they're protecting their own power or the wilting ladies. The state is an apparatus that should never be permitted to circumvent the rights of individuals to due process, the rule of law, and the state's burden to prove its case, not for any reason. You want to live in a country like that? Go ahead and move to one. When someone commits a rape, it is the rapist committing a crime. When the state imprisons an innocent person who has been prevented by that state from presenting an adequate or competent defense, it is the state that has committed that crime. And unlike the rapist, the state has a massive apparatus to help them do it. Hundreds of people who are paid to do just that work on behalf of the state. Unlike the rapist, the state has the entire weight of the system at its disposal to hold its victim down and have its way with him. Unlike the rapist, The state's actions are legitimated rather than condemned and censured by the consensus of the public. As I said in the video, I would hope people would be willing to hold our government and our courts to a higher standard of integrity and decency than we do our rapists. Your mileage may vary, I guess.
Aren't you aware that statistically, sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes in our society?
Don't care.
And the way alleged victims are treated is part of the problem.
Don't care.
At the moment, it is pretty much impossible to get a conviction because until a few years ago, the type of evidence allowed in to discredit the alleged victims included what kind of panties she was wearing at the time.
You do realize that rape was the last non-lethal offense against a person to be subject to the death penalty, right? In pretty much every Western country. You also have to consider rape law in the context of the time. Back in the first half of the 20th century, it was assumed that women were unlikely to engage in sex outside of marriage, or at least outside of relationships. You do realize that half the time a complainant's sexual history was brought into the courtroom, it was brought by the prosecution, right? Why would you think that would be? Because if a young woman was demonstrably virtuous, the jury would have no doubt whatsoever as to whether the sex was non-consensual. Obviously, she didn't consent to sex with this guy she went on one date with because she wasn't the type of woman who would consent to sex outside of a serious relationship. Slam dunk. It's very easy, especially since the advent of DNA evidence, to successfully prosecute instances of stranger rape. Consider this scenario. A young woman is out jogging in the park at 5 a.m. Some guy she doesn't know jumps out of the bushes, beats her to a pulp, cuts her with the knife he's using, and rapes her. There is no universe in which a judge or jury would ever consider it within the barest realm of possibility that this woman consented to that act. Now consider this one. A woman goes on several dates with a guy. He invites her to a weekend event where they share a hotel room with her consent. They engage in sexual activity of various forms. At some point during the weekend, he rapes her. She stays with him for the entire duration of the rest of the weekend. They take pictures together after the alleged rape where she's smiling adoringly at him. They part ways amicably. Within 10 hours, she emails him to say how much she enjoyed the weekend and she's looking forward to doing it again. Her language is highly intimate, or highly coarse and profane, depending on whether the person reading is me or my mother. Her comments refer directly to the incident she is now calling rape and how much she enjoyed it. She sends him flowers and says she wants to hook up with him again. She continues to pursue an intimate relationship with him in emails, texts, and handwritten love letters for a year or more following this traumatizing rape. Do you not think that, based on these facts, it's a little harder to determine that the woman in the second scenario would never have consented to the act that she's now describing as rape? The problem with prosecuting rape is that it has become a crime based entirely on state of mind, her lack of consent and his awareness of her lack of consent. In the scenario of the stranger rapist jumping out of the bushes with a weapon and beating a woman half to death, the question of consent isn't even a question. No woman ever would consent to such a thing. All you have to do is attach the perpetrator to the crime with forensic evidence. But date rape? In this day and age? That's a different beast. It's not unreasonable to believe that a woman might consent to sex in a dating context. It becomes even less unreasonable if she aggressively pursues further sexual relationships with him for more than a year after the fact. Consent is the only element of the crime now, and I'm sorry, but sexual liberation of women has muddied that water for a lot of victims. Whereas in the 1950s, a jury might think it unreasonable to assume a respectable woman would ever consent to casual sex, a jury today will think it is unreasonable to assume there is a woman on earth who would never, under any circumstance whatsoever, consent to casual sex.
People are advocating for change, Ms. Strawn, not because they want to give the state more power to ruin people's lives without due process, but because the current system simply doesn't work.
The current system has already been reformed beyond recognition. The procedures, processes, and protections are different for sexual assault than they are for any other serious felony, and all of these reforms have been in the direction of helping rape victims and making convictions easier.
Are you not aware of some of the deplorable comments made by judges during sexual assault trials, essentially grilling the alleged victim for not resisting more, keeping her legs closed, etc.?
Don't care.
Also, let's not pretend that sexual assault is not a gendered offense, with the overwhelming victims and alleged victims being women.
That's actually false. Roughly half of the victims of sexual assault are men, and roughly half of the perpetrators are women. That is, if we're going to define sexual assault equitably, unlike the CDC, which calls a man forcing a woman into sexual intercourse rape, and a woman forcing a man into sexual intercourse other sexual violence. If you think women underreport sexual assault, you need to do some reading on male victims, who are at least 10 times less likely to report than female victims, particularly if their perpetrator is female. I'll leave some links in the low bar for you.
The policies you're criticizing are an attempt to balance a skewed system, not to throw a balanced system out of whack.
How is the system skewed? It's not skewed in favor of male victims or male perpetrators, so how is it skewed? Is it skewed the same way the KKK insisted it was skewed back in the Jim Crow days? You know, back when the KKK were asserting that due process and the presumption of innocence unfairly privileged black rapists and disadvantaged white female victims? You mean like that?
The presumption of innocence must remain a salient feature of our legal system.
How generous of you.
But, Ms. Strawn, our daughters, under our current system, would find it next to impossible to convict a person even if they were actually sexually assaulted. And the stats, by the way, say that it is very likely that they will be in some way.
Don't care. I really don't. And that's speaking as someone who's been sexually assaulted and didn't report it. Not because I was worried I wouldn't be believed either. In fact, the stats you seem so enamored with indicate that the reason the vast majority of female victims of sexual assault don't report is not that they fear they won't be believed, not that they're afraid of being re-victimized, not that they're ashamed. The primary reason given by these women is that what happened just wasn't that big a deal. It just wasn't important enough. I felt the same way. But you know what else I knew? My father wouldn't have seen things that way. And if I'd reported it, he'd find out, and then he'd have landed his ass in prison for aggravated assault or attempted murder. Priorities.
You're absolutely right that it's hard to tell in some cases a real victim from an angry ex-lover, but let's not overstate how often this happens or pretend that the system right now in any way protects women.
I don't recall indicating at all in that video any position on how often such things happen. Let's say it's 2%. There are about 14,000 sexual assaults reported to the police yearly in Canada. That's potentially 280 innocent men held down by the state and fucked against their will for months or years on end. Not by a rapist, not by a criminal, by our own government, by police, the Crown, and the prison system. Let's say the false report rate is 8%. That's over 1,000 men who stand to be victimized not by criminals, but by the institutions in whose trust we have all placed our lives, the institutions we have allowed the power and authority to remove people from their lives and throw them in cages. What if the false report rate is 15%? What if it's 25%? And one of the really awful things is, even with the system as it is now, it is poor and minority men who are most at risk of being falsely or wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. Brian Banks, a young black high school student, was told by his public defender to take a plea deal because as a young, muscle-bound black athlete, he didn't stand a chance at trial. And as much as I hate to say it, that was good advice. Without the funds to hire Marie Hennen, with only the overtaxed services of a public defender, he'd have been toast. Of course, it turns out the entire allegation was completely fabricated by the accuser by her own admission after Banks had served his entire sentence of almost 6 years and lost any real shot he had at a professional football career. The Innocence Project in the US has been keeping track of the types of crimes for which they've secured exonerations. Rape of women is surpassed only by murder. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those murders involved sex crimes against women. Think Guy Paul Moran, or David Milgaard, or Stephen Truscott, who was incidentally sentenced to hang at age 14 and was finally exonerated in his 60s. And for the exoneration secured through DNA evidence, the number is roughly 50%. About half of all exonerations the Innocence Project has secured through DNA evidence were of men wrongfully convicted of sexually assaulting women. If false or wrongful accusations of rape are so rare, how is it that these numbers can exist? If it's so hard to convict a rapist, how is it that we get it wrong in terms of wrongful convictions more often with rape than with almost any other crime? And you want to continue to meddle with the system because it doesn't work? Doesn't work for whom?
I, too, was appalled at how quickly the case against Ghomeshi came apart, and no one should be convicted under evidence that spurious. However, like you said, part of the problem is with the way the system investigates and prosecutes these allegations.
I specifically pointed to a problem with feminist influence on investigatory practices. If you want to discuss those, I'm perfectly happy to. However, if investigatory practices are such that policy looks identical to incompetence, I'm really not that interested in a discussion on how we can amend the trial process to conform to that level of incompetence.
We seem to have swung the pendulum from one end to the other.
In what way? Are you saying that back during the heyday of patriarchy, when rape was a capital crime and conviction rates were as good or better than they are now, as good for working class victims as for all victims now and twice as good for upper class victims, that things were great, and that all the feminist reforms to the law and our social ethic of egalitarianism is just swinging the pendulum too far?
I'm sure you will recall that it wasn't that long ago when a husband was legally incapable of raping his wife.
Yeah, that's a little simplistic. The law was such that both husbands and wives enjoyed a statutory assumption of consent to sex within marriage because the marriage contract implicitly is a contract to a sexual relationship. Nobody got married thinking, I never want to have sex again. People get married and got married in order to codify a romantic and sexual, intimate relationship. The idea that sex is part of marriage was and still is a thing. I'm sorry, that's just the way things are. The idea that marital rape was condoned by the culture or permitted by the law is ridiculous. While marital rape was officially acknowledged in the second half of the 20th century, restraining one's wife or violating her security of the peace was a criminal offense, all the way back to Blackstone and earlier. If a man forced his wife to have sex against her will, it might not have been considered rape, but it was still considered a crime.
Or that an alleged victim of sexual assault needed to have her story corroborated by at least one external witness.
Even under Sharia law, that does not apply in circumstances where there are no potential witnesses. That is, even under Sharia, a rape victim only needs witness corroboration within city limits, essentially within screaming distance of other people. If a woman is raped in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it stands up in court.
Yes, these were the laws we had on the books.
And I would invite you to actually look at the statutes rather than the feminist criticisms and interpretations of and grievances with the statutes.
I agree that we absolutely should make sure that a case has a fighting chance after doing a lot of investigation before bringing a charge.
Keyword here is investigation.
But the way we have historically done is ended up being a huge deterrent for a lot of women because our police departments had their own ideas about what a solid case and a good victim looked like.
And that's a shame. Let's just do away with due process and presumption of innocence because having to answer questions is difficult for some women.
And if you didn't fit the bill, they'd basically tell you to suck it up and move on with your life.
The way they tell the vast majority of male rape victims, like that. The rape victims that don't even get counted as rape victims in CDC surveys because they're male and somehow it's just different. You mean like those guys? Or the wrongfully or rightfully accused who end up in prison being repeatedly raped by other inmates and staff while the system turns a blind eye? Suck it up, move on with your life, Brian Banks. Suck it up, move on with your life, Stephen Truscott. Suck it up, move on with your life, David Milgaard. Like that?
I don't mind your dissatisfaction with the direction some advocates are pushing for the legal system to move in. What is baffling is that your righteous anger seemingly ignores the crisis situation regarding sexual assault prosecutions that have pushed us to where we are.
Oh, I'm so glad you don't mind. It was actually my first consideration when I made that video, whether Nathan Yu would mind or not. As for the crisis situation regarding sexual assault, you might actually be unaware that sexual assault, like all crime, and particularly violent crime, has been in steep decline since the 1980s. The only way feminists can kick and scream about a sexual assault crisis is by using such a broad definition of sexual assault that the vast majority of victims don't report it because the incident was too minor or insignificant to bother, and by refusing to ask survey participants if they were actually sexually assaulted. You want to know why they don't ask that? Because when they do, up to 70% of the women who the survey takers categorized as victims of sexual assault disagree with that finding, and a significant minority say they did not feel violated in any way. Listen and believe, like all other feminist roads, only leads in one direction.
For the sake of future generations, I hope the system changes.
And you know what? I hope it doesn't. Because I have the ability to see the big picture. Not just one asshole I can't stand who could eat a bag of dicks for all I care, who managed to get acquitted when you and some other people believe he should have been convicted. You erode due process for some, you erode it for all. Not just men like Ghomeshi, but for men like your brothers, fathers, and sons, and yourself. And eventually, for your sisters, mothers, and daughters. You justify reducing the burden of proof for some people, you are justifying reducing it for all. And I got no fucking patience for that. Anyhow, that's it for me. Please keep in mind, if your calendar is free between the 21st and 23rd of April, and you are somewhere near Toronto, Montreal, or Ottawa, to go check out Tim Goldich. He's a sweetie. I got to meet him at the last ICMI in Detroit in 2014. And he's just absolutely wonderful. And also keep in mind, if you know a business that needs somebody to lift heavy objects for hours on end, or do some other form of shipping, receiving, anything like that, labor, industrial work, all of that, that Nick Redding is currently looking for employment, and I'd really love it if we could come together and help him out a little bit. So I'm going to reserve the commentary of one of the other commenters for another video, and hopefully that'll be up in the next few days. But until then,